the underbelly of dressage saddle design, fashion and function. In this presentation we'll explore the numerous design choices for the underside of dressage saddles and discuss the pros and cons of different options. Saddle design is such a minefield for horse owners. If you're looking for a new saddle, how are you going to decide what sort of saddle design features you're going to be wanting for your particular horse? There are so many options and so many different opinions out there. And how do you know what is good and what is not so good for your horse? That's something we're going to try and get into today. Using Olympians to pick the best saddle would be an easy way to go around it. You'd have a very easy, straightforward process. However, not only do the horses that Olympians ride varies a great deal from our normal horse, they get better ridden than the average horse. They receive higher levels of exercise and higher levels of back care. The elite horses' backs are usually much more muscled, the horse is much fitter and stronger, and the posture of horses much better. So as much as we would like to think our horses are every bit as wonderful as an Olympic horse, they rarely match the profile of one. And usually the saddles that work well for the elite horses are not actually the perfect ones for our own individual horse, our best mate. Let's go on with that exploration. To go back to the basics, the role of the saddles is to provide a secure, comfortable and balanced platform for the rider. And at the same time, it needs to be a comfortable interface between the rider and the horse so that the horse is most comfortable. Both these aims are interrelated. If the rider is not comfortable and well balanced, the horse's action and performance will be affected negatively. If the horse is not as comfortable as possible, its posture, movement and performance too will be badly affected. Let's also look at a few basic points of the saddle so we're all speaking the same language when we go through these design elements. We all know the pommel and the cantle of the saddle. We've got the saddle seat, of course. We've got the twist of the saddle, which we'll go into a bit more in a second. We've got the tree point and the stirrup bar. These are all important parts of the design of the saddle. The twist of the saddle varies through different brands and different options within brands, and that's something to be considered. The billets, the panels, the tree with inside. We'll talk about all of these different things in different parts of the saddle. Underneath the saddle, the saddle panel is not just the same all the way through. It has different components, the seat panel, the waist panel and the tree point panel, and we'll talk about the different aspects of those. The gullet underneath the head of the saddle starts here and continues right through. In this area we tend to call it the channel, and that in itself is a very important issue too. The tree is the framework of the saddle. It's the heart of the saddle structure. The trees are made to match the anatomy of the horse's back. They vary in materials, flexibility and adaptability. Their role is to support the panels under the saddle and the rider's seat above. And together with the panels, the tree is there to spread the pressure from the rider's weight over a larger area as practical. The tree is the anchor for the other components of the saddle, such as the girth billets, the stirrup bars, the foundation of the gullet or head plate of the saddle. This is just to give you a view of the saddle tree from underneath. In a traditional tree, there's webbing under here to hold things together and create the seat for the rider. In this plastic tree, it's built in, and you can see the tree point down here and a gullet plate in this case. The saddle panels sit between the tree and the horse, of course. They vary a lot in size and shape, and we'll discuss that, but they're an individual item in itself. To be able to understand the importance of different saddle designs, it's also important that we understand the sensitivities of the horse's back. The tips of the bone of the wither are one of the fundamental areas. We learned this as a very young rider to avoid pressure on this region here. You can see a little bit of wear here from a rug, but the saddle shouldn't actually come in contact with these tips. There's not a lot between the tips and the skin surface. The wither muscle is a very important area because it carries a big load. And if we look at it as just one homogeneous lot of muscle, then we actually miss the point that all these muscles are not the same. The ones that are actually compressed against the bone, the spinalis thoracis and the end of the multifidus here, these are the ones most susceptible to any pressure coming on them. Down here, these muscles are much less susceptible because they carry more of a horizontal load against the rib cage. The trapezius and rhomboid usually don't suffer any great pressure effects. It's when the muscle is squeezed against the bone. The other thing about this spinalis thoracis muscle is very often when there's dysfunction of the spine through the upper thoracic area, this muscle in itself is quite hyperactive, hypersensitive, and any great pressure on that muscle causes quite a bit of trouble. We've got other little skin muscles as well underneath here. They sort of finish about here, but their effects are felt right up here that move the skin up here. If they're sensitized by spinal dysfunction, then they can cause a lot of grief through the wither area as well. So looking at the spinalis, it basically starts at the base of the wither and goes across in a triangular shape, but it ends up at the base of the neck. So if it's tight, it'll pull up the base of the neck. And we've got to be particularly mindful that saddles not only provide downward pressure, but they provide inward pressure, and that inward pressure increases as this angle gets more acute. For a flat withered horse, it's mainly horizontal pressure. For a more acute withered horse, there's a lot more inward pressure. So the more we can transfer the weight out here, the better for the horse. The small muscles surrounding the vertebrae are also ones that we've got to take particular care of. Not only are they very sensitive muscles, they are involved with the control of the spinal column in itself. Also, when it comes to the saddle seat area, they're very easily trapped against the bone in horses that have lost muscle over their back and haven't got a very good protective fat layer either. So we need to really watch that these are taken care of. It's particularly important if saddles are slipping to one side as well, because the saddle channel will come over and the panels will come more onto those more central little muscles. The rib angles is another area we've got to protect. If we put too much pressure on these rib angles, and that's the area from where the rib changes from being fairly horizontal up here to being fairly vertical. And in more sprung ribs, that's less obvious, but in a fitter ventissae, it's quite obvious that there is a big change between these two elements of the rib. The actual angle of the change is called the rib angle, and there's usually a notch that's associated with muscle attachments. If there's too much pressure put on top of those little muscles, they can become very painful. So it's another area we've got to protect. We'll talk more about this area down the track because that's just as important. The saddle seat area under our seat bones is actually the weakest part of the horse's back, contrary to some of the things you hear about the horse's back strength. So that's about this area here. It's the furthest from the front leg and it's the furthest from the hind leg. So it's sort of hanging in the middle of a bridge, if you like. It's not supported by the sternum like the first 8 vertebrae are here. It is just supported by the abdominal muscles. And if these abdominal muscles are not active and strong, then this area can drop, and that can leave them very susceptible to pressure in that area. Contrary to popular belief too, this area, the lumbar area, is not the weakest part of the back. It's actually one of the strongest parts of the back. It's where circus riders will stand when they're going around in circles. And why would they stand on the weakest part of the horse's back? Pain at the rear of the saddle seat is a really common entity where you've got a belly dropping like this one, because you've got a drop through here and the loin tends to go up, and you've got a junctional area where the end of the rib cage occurs and the start of the loin, and that area gets quite stressed as a result of this upward and downward movement in opposite directions. It is an area that we often see painful strain in horses. Even in a horse with not such great back muscling like this can have quite a lot of strain in that portion of the back. Horses that have a really nice straight back through here, like a quarter horse with a really strong back, we don't see that strain element so much, and we don't see this pain in this junctional area hardly at all, and they're much less prone to trouble with saddles that creep or go towards the back of the rib cage. Whereas horses like this one and this one cannot handle long saddles at all. The girth area is one we've got to protect in two ways. We've got to make sure that the girth is suitable, and we'll talk about that more later. But this is also a sensitized area of the horse. When I say sensitized, when there's spinal dysfunction under the shoulder blade, that can sensitize the nerve, just like our lower back can be very tight and tender when we've got back trouble. When a horse has got upper thoracic spinal dysfunction, which is super common in horses, then they can be very sensitive, not only through the wither but down into the girth. If you want to know more about this, and it's something you should know plenty about, then go on to my Spinal Vet Education channel, and there's a video there dedicated just to the girth, and there's also one on birth trauma which highly interrelates with this. When we're talking about just the physical pressure on the girth area, this is the area we've got to protect the most. This area here where the ribs meet the sternum, the costochondral junction, is one that really is susceptible to damage. We've got the ascending pectoral muscle here that is coming against this sort of hard angular change, and too much pressure on that can lead to a lot of pain. So we'll be talking about girth structures. This one, for that matter, is effectively only about that wide, and despite its padding, is not a particularly good girth for the horse. Let's look at the components of the underbelly of the saddle. The internal framework of the saddle is something we should consider more here. In these times of great innovations, most saddles have an internal framework or tree, though treeless saddles are more and more making their way as an option for some horse shapes. The reason behind using a framework within the saddle is to provide maximum stability for the rider and to produce a greater amount of functional support for the panels that lie directly over the horse's back. In other words, the tree is there to spread the load of the rider and, for that matter, the pressure from the girth. To work best, the tree shape needs to be closely matched to the horse's back and broadly support the panels in their pressure carrying role. The trees of the saddle come in various types, ranging from a long way back, like when these sorts of trees were more common in saddles, where they were just using singular bits of wood that was shaped and twisted to match the shape of the horse. Sadly, these sort of saddles are very prone to actually cracking and breaking, so they were replaced by these laminated beechwood saddles with spring supports to actually give them a bit more sideways twisting flex. These sort of trees have webbing over them to fill them in, so they look a bit more like this when they're in a complete sort of setting. We've got plenty of other options in tree materials now that are used, like these different plastic style trees, and including ones with innovations to allow freer movement of the front of the saddle. And we've got ones too that are cutting edge that use carbon fibre or Kevlar in the saddles to give more strength to the tree and lightness to the tree. The trees of modern saddles are quite stiff lengthways, but have a degree of rotation towards the front of the waist or the head. The lengthwise stiffness prevents the saddle bowing in the middle because if you have too much give through the middle, you're going to put excessive pressure through the middle of the saddle where most of the rider's weight is concentrated. So that stiffness lengthways is really important, and allows the maintenance of even pressure along the panel from front to back, rather than loading the middle of the back where the tree and the panel are often least supportive of the rider. Most saddle trees are flexible in rotation through the head, and this allows the saddle to be stable at the seat, but at the same time rotate with the movement of the thorax of the horse when one leg is loaded and the other leg is unloaded. Flexible tree saddles have some degree of flex both lengthways and through the head. Usually these saddles have a supportive arch over the wither portion, and that arch varies with how far it goes down. And the saddles have an inner structure that is of materials that combine some degree of stiffness and some degree of flexibility to enable the support for the rider and the girth points and the stirrup hangers, so as to make a fairly stable platform for the rider, while at the same time as having plenty of flexibility to conform to the changing shape of the horse in motion. Frequently, panels of flexible tree saddles extend up towards the midline or the channel and gullet of the saddle. In rounded horses with plenty of muscle and fat cover over the spine, this can be quite comfortable. In my experience of horses with narrower angled withers and treeless saddles, they're not usually so comfortable for the horse coming up into the wither, and we need to actually somehow lift the saddle away from the spine in those cases. The pressure under treeless and tree saddles has been looked at in a number of research papers. For the average horse, well-fitted and well-matched saddles with an internal tree have been found to spread the rider's weight over a greater surface area and have shown to have lower pressures under the saddle than treeless saddles. Let's look at the head plates and gullet plates of the saddle. Fixed gullet plates have been used for a long time in saddles. Usually 2 bits of metal are used, one above and below the actual saddle tree, and these are riveted together. And because the laminate of these trees is fairly stiff in itself, and this is stiff, only usually one change in gullet fitting, either bigger or smaller, is recommended for these saddles, because very quickly these rivets start to break with the movement and the wood in between gets looser, and this becomes a less rigid component of the saddle. So they're suited nicely to horses that stay much the same weight throughout the year and same body condition. They're kept in exercise and full work for the whole year, and in the same nutrition for the whole year. So their body weight and condition is pretty static, and these are quite suited for those sort of horses. For those that vary more, we've got a whole lot of changeable aspects to the gullet. Bendable gullet plates are an alternative to fixed ones. They can be altered by a saddle fitter or a saddler with a suitable gullet vise. Some can be changed both in angle and also breadth, and that's an advantage to fit a wider range of horses. If the changes in the gullet angle are not performed very carefully, the result can be asymmetric saddles when only widening or narrowing was the aim. In some cases though, gullet plates are purposely made a little bit asymmetric to fit the asymmetry of the horse, and this works in some cases and doesn't work so well in others. Depends whether that asymmetry is dynamic or is just static, or the standing horse that's asymmetric. So this is an example of a gullet vise. Interchangeable gullet systems. These are common to a number of brands now throughout the world. These are the most readily adjustable systems. They're easy for the saddle fitter to adjust, and even some owners can adjust them under the guidelines of a saddle fitter. These systems allow the gullet to be readily adjusted as the horse changes in weight and fitness, whereas some systems that really require a very skilled and well qualified saddle fitter to do it may be delayed much more than they should be, and that can be detrimental for the development of a young horse or development for a horse that's coming back into work. So it's got advantage in that way. The ease is a real plus. There are variations in the plates between different saddle makers. Ideally, the plates should get broader as the angle gets flatter, if you like. Ideally, these plates are long enough to support a fairly long tree point, but we'll get into that too. And some would differ in their opinion on that, but certainly in my horse back pain practice, that is very much the case. Stirrup points, well, you might say they're part of the upper part of the saddle, and absolutely they are. But they also support the panel underneath, so they're an important part of the underside of the saddle too. Sometimes if the twist is too narrow through the front of the saddle, for the horse that is, it's coming in too acutely, then the stirrup bar can really press on the lower wither, and the more uncomfortable the horse gets in the lower wither, the more likely it is to spasm there, and that's going to make it even tighter and less comfortable and even damaging in some cases. While we're digressing for a bit, some saddles have the option to have different placement of your stirrup point, as in these two. Some are very much fixed, some are forward, some are more back for when you want a very upright and classic dressage position, or some are more forward when you want to actually have a little bit more of a chair seat to give you more stability, particularly if you're a novice rider. Let's look at the panels now. Bit of a historical perspective for a start. This is a traditional Spanish saddle that has a huge panel under it for really covering large distances and keeping the horse's back comfortable. And this is a traditional Portuguese one, so quite different from our modern saddles today. This one's one of our family heirloom saddles that are from early in the 20th century. And there's quite a bit of support through the panel through here. Just ignore the fact that this has got a broken tree and it's come closer through the middle and it's deteriorating in many ways, seeing it's probably 125 years old, this saddle. This one here is a 1950s saddle. So it was used in the Royal Melbourne Show, and it's got quite a decent panel under it and quite a decent amount of support through the actual panel here. And you can see how the panel is actually angled down to give maximum support for the rider's weight. And the actual tree point under my thumb there is quite long. Compare that to the modern saddles of today, where we've got much less panel most often and much less support for the rider, even though people these days are usually heavier and have greater height than the ones in earlier times. We've got less support for the actual rider, so that has consequences. What sort of panel fill is that? That's another important variability, and it suits different situations. Most are filled with various sorts of wool flocks. They can be natural or synthetic. Each different sheep breed has wool that, and even within a breed can have wool that's got different sort of spring to it, and each different synthetic flock has got a different amount of spring to it, so they're not exactly the same medium. And if you're having your flocking adjusted in your saddle, make sure that the saddle is using the same flock as should be used in that saddle that was originally used in the saddle. Unless they're replacing the whole lot of it, they should be using the same sort of flock as what was used originally. Wool of various sorts, whether it be synthetic or sheep wool, has a spring action of when it's getting compressed, and all of us are familiar with this with a Dacron type pillow with the amount of spring it has for a start. With repeated compression, the spring actually fatigues over time, and then it becomes dull and firm and a poorly forgiving or bouncing fill and cushioning fill. So things change over time. The saddle fitters and saddlers progressively add an outer layer of soft flock between the horse and the rider, renews the springiness of the flock as things compress down. If the saddle gets too heavily filled and with flock, then it usually becomes quite hard and uncomfortable for the horse. And in that case, and before that actually occurs, the flock should be completely removed and replaced. If you've got new flock that's quite a thick panel, then it's going to drop quite a lot where there is higher pressures, and there tends to be higher pressures over the wither of horses with more angulation, and the saddle tends to drop more readily through that area as it is. So be very wary with new saddles that you get the saddles adjusted early enough. A saddle that is adjusted for that horse right from the start should actually have feel added and pounded down and hardened through the front. If they've got a bit of, say, muscle atrophy through the wither, it's got to be done correctly. Otherwise, you're going to start riding and very soon you'll be actually falling forward, and then you'll lean back to compensate and your legs will go in the wrong direction. And this is going to create real difficulty for you, and you're going to think that the saddle is terrible when it's just the fact that it hasn't been kept balanced. And you've got to get your saddle fitted back more readily the more flock there is in that brand new saddle. The other thing that happens with flock is, because we're doing this sort of action against the horse, there's a bit of a swirling action within the panel, and balls of flock actually get produced from that. They actually turn into little hard lumps, and these need to be actually taken out by your saddle fitter and replaced with new flock. The other thing is flock, particularly on ones that don't have a very flat wither, that have more angular wither, the flock from the bottom of the panel in the wither section will push upwards and will end up being thicker at the top and thinner at the bottom. And this is taking away pressure where we want to keep it on and adding pressure to the upper part of the panel where we actually want to keep it light, because it's often, as I talked about the spinalis thoracis muscle there, it's often a sensitive part. So we need to be aware that that is a bad change and needs to be addressed reasonably frequently. Foam overcomes a lot of those problems, and it's frequently utilised in saddles to provide a nice cushioning effect against the horse. When a horse has a good muscle coverage and maintains a relatively stable body weight and condition, these panels can function quite effectively, requiring a minimum of maintenance while enabling close contact between the rider and the horse. However, it's essential that the shape of the tree and the panels very closely align with the horse's back when it is in a good working frame. Not when it's just standing there in the stable yard, but when it's actually out there working and the muscles are filled up with blood and so forth, and the horse has lifted its back well. Typically, these panels, though, are very challenging to modify, making them unsuitable for horses that experience changes in muscle development and body condition throughout the year, or those that have areas of muscle wastage. Another type of fill is air, and there's two main uses of air panels, and that is wow saddlery and the bait saddlery. Each use two airbags on each side of the saddle, but the airbag type varies a great deal. The flare panels invented by WOW are ones that are inflated, and the inflation is changed according to getting the saddle well balanced under the rider. So it can be lifted at the front or the back, it can be lifted or dropped from side to side according to what is needed for the individual horse. It's done in a static situation, so it's not perfect. It needs to be assessed when the horse is, when actively ridden as well. If these are too firm, then it can be less comfortable for the horse's back. If they're too soft, there can be too much movement. The latest version of these involves a smaller airbag and more foam, so there's less instability being a possibility there. Care air panels. These consist of sealed, uniquely shaped bags with air and open cell foam within those bags. Each side has two overlapping bags, and these bags are designed to be relatively thin, ensuring a fairly close fit to the horse's back. Because all horses' backs aren't perfectly shaped to suit the tree of these saddles, the tree is actually changed in shape by using inserts within another part of the panel to change the shape of the tree to better match the horse's back. If the horse has lost muscle through the back or has very steep wither, these panels have a bit of difficulty in actually matching the back well without making the pressure on the actual care bags too tight. And when that happens, it makes them a very hard interface between the saddle and the horse, and in that case they're not very comfortable for the horse. But in cases where we can keep it nice and matched, it works really nicely. There is limitation of panel function, and really the panel function is only as good as the framework or the saddle tree above it and how well that supports the panel. In areas like this where there is a gusseted panel and there's actually no framework above it, the actual function of this part of the panel, for instance, relies on this being filled well. If it's lightly filled, then this is not going to function at all. But further to that, there are lots of situations where you can have a large panel, but it's not well supported by the actual saddle tree. Just to press that point a little bit further, this is an independent panel here with the tree point pocket, and the tree point's going to be under here. You can see that this bit here is just floating in mid-space. It's not supported by much in the way of either the tree or, and it's the same under here, or the stirrup bar. It's only supported by the flap under the rider's leg, and that is nowhere near the same support as being given by the tree point. So there's a lot of variability of support and not very good support through this section here. One manufacturer has got around the problems with panel support by actually putting a semi-rigid plate above his panels, and this actually effectively improves the support through this area here that would not be very well supported otherwise, and right through the actual saddle itself. Reportedly, this has allowed the manufacturer to produce saddles of equivalent comfort from a thinner panel, allowing closer contact between the horse and the rider, which is a very handy bonus. And even if you weren't after close contact, but you wanted to fill more panel to actually fill where there'd been atrophy, that sort of system can really help make the panel work so much better and support the rider so much better in itself. Now, if we look at another aspect of the saddle, look at the flaps, we've got a big preponderance of mono flap saddles these days with only one flap and an independent panel, one that's not stitched to that flap. So in this case, the panel is stitched to that flap, and in being stitched to the flap, it gives more rigidity and support for this part of the panel. Here we've got much poorer support, so we've got lovely big panels, but not very well support right through this area here. We've got good support here, great support over the tree point perhaps, but not much support through this part here other than the saddle flap. Let's have a look at the front third of the saddle in particular. The front of the saddle carries the weight transmitted by the stirrup bars. It carries the weight of the rider in 2-point or rising trot. It carries a third or more of the rider's seated weight. Tightening the girth pulls down on this area too, and especially does so if a tree point girth attachment is used. So that's a billet towards the front of the saddle. That will really pull down onto the wither. Thus, there's a great need to spread the pressure over as large an area as possible through this wither region of the horse. Also, it's very important to minimise the vector of inward pressure that's being directed against the muscle lying just lateral or beside the bone of the vertebrae, the dorsal spinous process of the vertebrae of the wither. It's important too that the front of the saddle does not interfere with the shoulder blade movement. So when we design the front, we've got to make it comfortable for a horse to stretch out in front. For a horse to extend its leg forward comfortably, the upper part of the scapula or shoulder blade must have the freedom to move back beneath the saddle as it does. This movement of the shoulder blade under the saddle is facilitated by the fact that the cartilage top of the shoulder blade is angular and will slip under the saddle readily in most cases. The front section of the saddle should not be so hard or as rigid as to block the movement of the scapula underneath the saddle itself. If the saddle is positioned too far forward and is jammed up against or on top of the shoulder blade, it can damage the scapular cartilage as well as the often sensitive origin of the serratus ventralis thoracis muscle. This portion of the upper part of the serratus ventralis muscle that attaches to the bone here seems to be prone to pain that is probably associated with strain of the muscle attachment here. The cartilage itself is not able to sustain pressure for a long period of time. If this part of the serratus ventralis is tight, then often it'll produce trigger points underneath the latissimus dorsi in this area, creating a bulge in this area that's quite sensitive, and the saddle coming over the top of that can be a real problem too. One of the reasons that the saddle needs to be comfortable in this area is because dysfunction often affects this region of the spine and also the girth, and so any soreness in those areas is going to stop the horse being able to stretch out its front leg properly, because the muscles of the skin in this area will tighten and get overly sensitized, and these muscles will tighten, including the long head of the triceps, and that will restrict foreleg protraction. Thus, for best performance, the saddle and girth combination must be gentle on these areas, the girth and the wither area. We'll talk more about that shortly. Common options for the front of the saddle, and this is one that particularly affects the spinalis thoracis muscle of the horse. Short tree points are one of the biggest ones that affect this area. This is a very fashionable option in saddles at the moment, with the idea that the saddle is not going to stop the shoulder blade moving backwards, and I think it's an ill-founded idea, in that the more comfortable we keep the withers, the more the horse is going to be able to stretch out in front. If we use short tree points to support that heavy pressure through the front of the saddle, then we're going to create significant pressure on the withers, which has an adverse impact on the overly sensitive spinalis thoracis muscle and the multifidus muscles deep to this tree point. Although the shorter tree points are thought to have less impact on the shoulder blade retraction compared to longer ones, they spread the load of the rider and the girth over a smaller area, which may increase the shear strain and pressure on one of the most sensitive areas affected by the saddle. Based on my observation, horses that are ridden for an extended period in saddles with short tree points often display noticeably more discomfort in their withers than those that are equipped with longer tree points, and they tend to show a greater limitation of the protraction of their forelegs when they're working. So if we look at the opposite situation with long tree points, long and broad ones are what you want, and this picture doesn't show it very well. This saddle, the tree point and the panel combination effectively acts from here through to here, so it's quite a big support for the front of the saddle. It's getting support from the actual stirrup bar as well. I'd like to see more support through this area here so the panels work even better, but that's another matter. But at least it allows that these panels aren't positioned too high. With short tree points too, we're really stuck with having the panels fairly high on the actual tree very often, and so that's coming up high into the wither, and with these angular withers can come right up against the area that's going to put pressure on to that spinalis thoracis muscle as well. As a side, having panels that rise high up into the gullet is crucial for activities where the horse may navigate turns very quickly, such as chasing stock or chasing a cow or jumping the horse. The design that comes up into the wither like this enhances the saddle stability by optimizing the clamping effect of the saddle gullet. The negative pressure effects of this clamping action can be helped a great deal too if the jumping saddles are only used for very active riding and avoided being used for slower hacking. So when it comes to stock saddles here in this country, they certainly give better stability on turns to come up high into the gullet, but invariably we see muscle loss through the wither area as a result of these clamping saddles, and we see deterioration of the horse's back as a result. And this is very commonly seen in stock horses out in the outback here in Australia and in the big stations, and I don't think it's realised well enough that the cause is actually that high pressure so often. If we could drop the pressure down, we would have a much better situation, because there's a lot of time in those stock saddles spent at a slower speed, and that causes quite a considerable amount of damage to the horse's wither area and back, and the whole back deteriorates as a result. If we have nice low placement of the panels and you need nice long tree points to allow this, then I find horses are usually much more comfortable and they can handle longer, slower rides where the pressure is much more statically set over their back. It's not perfect, but it's much more comfortable, and there's short, high tree points that are pressing in and clamping onto the sensitive muscles of the upper spine, and the muscles that have less sort of damping effect of more muscle between them and the bone. And just to show it on the wither, high up in the wither is going to come closer into the spinalis thoracis muscle, is sitting here against the bone. It's going to be clamped against the bone. It's going to have restricted blood flow in most cases where there's not really active motion happening. The pressure is supposed to be something like 3 to 5 times higher at the bone surface than it is at the skin surface. In these situations in humans and pigs where they've experimented on similar sort of situations, let's not do that to our horses if we can help it. By moving the pressure further down, and this is exaggerated of course, moving it further down, we've got much more horizontal support from the rib, and the horse is going to be a lot more comfortable with that downward pressure, and any inward pressure has got a much bigger buffer for it. Another option for the front of the saddle is how much padding you have here and how much support you have for that padding. We've talked about the support. The actual amount of padding varies in certain saddles. Some manufacturers thought it was a good idea to actually cut back this area so that the shoulder blade can move under here more easily. The trouble is this hugely reduces the support over the tree point where it's desperately needed. We don't want to just be sitting this bit onto the upper part of the wither. We want to be actually supporting this whole area better through here, not cutting things back where it's a crucial part. This area carries far too much weight. So I would advise against anything that looks like that. And there is a case for it, but not for 99% of horses. You will notice that in some saddles the panels are quite thin and some are fatter. These are called gusseted panels, where there's an extra bit of leather added and more ability to put flock. This is a thin, close contact one, so the horse and the saddle tree have got to be matched beautifully, and the horse isn't allowed to have any muscle atrophy or this won't work. This one will enable you to fill some holes of muscle atrophy and support the saddle better with flock. This one gives you limited options, just like so many of the foam tree saddles do. This is another option that gives more support through this region here. So this is a regular panel through the tree point area, and this is a drop panel or a trapezius front panel. This sadly doesn't work as well as we might like to think it will do, because it's poorly supported by the tree itself. It's just supported by the flat. So it's an improvement, but doesn't actually necessarily function that well. If we supported this panel better from above with some more rigid sort of material above it, we'd have a totally different situation. And this is another drop panel, and it certainly fills the space, spreads the load a bit better, but is not that effective unless the tree sits over it well and supports it well. To make this panel work well, the saddlers have to be careful to firm up the inner layers of this flock and just leave a nice soft layer on the body surface of the panel. If it's really soft through there, then the saddle will just drop too much in front and not work so well. Quilting is another option for the saddle, and it's used by some of the high-class saddleries, and it is something that normally should be left in place because it stabilizes the flock and also helps firm up the panel through this area. So even though the panel's not extra supported by anything stiff above it, the actual quilting stiffens this region of the panel. So it improves the function of the panel in my view, and can be an advantage in certain horses. The waist of the saddle is an area of the saddle that should be carrying a third of the rider's weight. Very often it's just incapable of that, and we'll go through that. In narrow-waisted saddles, if you put your hand under here and you'll feel there's a ridge of the edge of the tree and not much support for this panel. If they're narrow, you really can't add much flock through this area here without making it a hard tube. So it does not work very well. It still relies on all the pressure being carried here and here pretty well, where we've got more support for the panel. For that matter, if we look at the actual support for the waist panel by the bars of the tree, you can see here that this is the edge. Because the twist of the saddle, we're going from this rather flat supportive area to this edge of the panel that is not very supportive at all, and the panel is sitting over an edge, a knife edge if you like, and so it cannot work very well through there. And this is something I struggle with believing in these days of laser printed objects, that we could be actually 3D printing a saddle that actually supports this area here just as well as the seat, and would be such an advantage if we did, because we could have a thin panel there that's actually working properly. In this western tree, you can see there's a lot more support through this waist area, right through, just like that 1950 saddle I showed you. The twist of the saddle is something that's very important for the rider and the rider's comfort, and it's something that's got to be worked out between the saddle fitter and the rider as to what works best for a rider. Sometimes that is a priority with riders that have hip problems and the likes. What we're doing today though is looking at the underside of the saddle, so we'll leave that for the saddle fitters to talk to you. So this old tree shows the twist better than anything, I think. So the flat tree is coming around here to a more vertical portion through the wither, and this is called the twist. How narrow or wide this is will alter the comfort factors for the rider, but it also will have ramifications for the horses. If you've got a saddle with a narrow twist like this one that's coming up high into the wither, the pressure here in the low part of the wither can be immense, and the stirrup bar can add to that, and the horses tend to get spasm there, and then the spasm gets worse and worse because the pressure gets greater and greater. And this situation can be accompanied with a lot of pain for the horse and not really ideal at all. This saddle here gives you the idea of sort of one extreme of dressage saddle panel, and this gives you another. So somewhere in between those two saddles is likely to be the best for most horses. I should make a comment on monoflap and dual flap saddles. There's an independent panel, so I think we've mentioned along the way that we've got the tree point here supporting the front of the saddle or front of the panel, and here we haven't got much support at all. So lovely and big as though this panel is, it's not going to work all that well. We've got a lovely seat panel that's going to support the rider really well, but we're lacking a lot of support through this area here. There's a bit of support as a result of the rider's leg coming over the flap, but it's nothing like the rigid support of the tree point nor the seat. So we've got a change in support right through the saddle and inadequate support through this area. Where we've got a And this is a 1980 saddles where we've got a stitched in panel here and more fill through here, more support through this waist panel. This is going to be a lot more comfortable for the horse in some ways. The gullet width is an important sort of issue too narrow, and it will come down on the little spinal muscles as we've described. This is, you know, if there's plenty of muscle and fat padding over here, then this will work fine. This one here is for a horse that has obviously lost a lot of condition through its top line, but we've lost the size of panel as a result. So we've compromised in one way to actually fit with another way. Better, the horse puts on a lot of weight in the way of good muscling from being made comfortable and exercised in the right way. The lengthways shape of the tree, back in the 90s, this was very fashionable and caused a lot of damage to horses' back because of the curve of the saddle tree. It was, you know, held the rider in nicely, supported the rider nicely, but the panels came away from the horse's back and concentrated the pressure here. And for horses to cope with these saddles, they dropped their back down and became more dropped back in their shape, and that led to a lot of kissing spine pain and back strain and other trouble. And as a result, luckily, the industry decided their very fashionable saddle was not a good thing, and we ended up with much more flat saddles of the early 2000s. And the lengthways shape should be more like this, because most horses' backs are flatter through, and it should remain that way. If we go and look at some of these elements under the saddle seat, if you look at saddles that come away from the horse's back, say quickly to try and protect the loin area, and presuming this shouldn't come into the loin anyway, this is actually concentrating the weight in this part here, because even though it's not a banana-shaped tree, it's still coming away at the seat, and this acts like a fulcrum, so the cantle actually comes down like a crowbar onto this area here, levering more weight into that area. And remember what I said about the weakest part of the horse's back, and it's an area that is commonly associated with soreness and kissing spines and so forth. So you don't want to be loading it like this just because your horse's back might be a little bit short. Cutback panels likewise are going to do the same sort of thing. We've got a cantle that's way over the panel here. This has been made small to fit a short-backed horse. It's only going to create grief for that horse and grief for the rider. We've talked about the banana-type trees, and this is one with its flesh still in place, with its panel still in place. And you can see very easily, this is not supported. This is a big lever against this area, and it's going to just lead to kissing spines. The dead space under the saddle flap, I think, is just not such a major thing in some ways, but it's a lost opportunity in my view. This space here that's under the rider's leg, the rider's leg is not going to come into that space most of the time, so it's just vacant space. And as a result, we're losing the opportunity to support the rider better with better panel under this region here. So I find it strange that the saddle design has gone that way to make them neater or whatever. We've lost the opportunity that we've got to support it. So that dead space is well utilised in a saddle like this. So it can be done. It can be done much more effectively than just trying to meet a fashion that says you've got to get as close to the horse as you can. You'll get close to the horse fine with one like this. You don't need it. And sometimes I wonder, in situations like this, is the horse more responsive because they're more painful here, and perhaps a little less responsive because it's more comfortable in this situation? We've got to think of the welfare of the horse, surely. The girth points and billets, there's variability that we've got to look at. Obviously, where the girth is going to lie in this horse and this horse are totally the opposite extreme. In this racehorse, it's coming down here. In this horse, it's coming here in front of, or just behind the elbow. So not there, but there. So we've got to actually be able to accommodate to these different notches. And to do so, where you've got a a forward girth notch, you need a forward fitting for your saddle. So this is where tree point fittings come in. So this is an option that's really important. Most saddles either have them or can accommodate for them, or they can be added later by a good saddler. The other option that is important, I think, is to allow this fitting here to slide backwards and forwards. When you're using these 2 points on a horse that has got a more lifted belly, then you need to be able to slide this one back, and where you've got using the front point, you need to be able to keep it slid forward. The aim is that you've got to always have these points vertical. If you have points that are angular, it will pull the saddle forward onto the shoulder blade all the time, just by simple physics. This one, billet option here, where you've got 3 different billets all together, can work for horses that have got a more backward notch. This one, not as well, but just on the borderline. While we're at it, I should mention this girth. This girth is only as effective as that little band in the middle. The side bits are really only fluff that are just added to make it look better, but it's effectively only 2.5 centimetres, at the most 3 centimetres wide. Avoid girths that are cut in like that. They're not going to work that well for the horse. They're going to look okay. They're going to get out of the way of the elbow perhaps, but no, they're not very comfortable for the horse. In the case of monoflap saddles, then we can have a real problem where the points are stitched in. See, this one's already on an angle. That one's coming straight down perpendicularly. That one's on an angle. It's going to pull the saddle forward. So it's not working ideally in most situations. This one is accommodated for having a tree point strap by having a variable or a movable rear point as well. So it can work with both middle and back or front and back quite well. Here we're really stuck with just middle points. So the horses have really got to be quite fit and have a backward girth notch rather than a forward one for this to work. As I mentioned along the way, this sort of square corner of the sternum, the costochondral junction, is where horses really feel the pressure. And you can see here we've had pressure damage coming over. This is underneath the skin is the ascending pectoral muscle, which is quite prone to soreness, and over tightening of the girth has led to this. I've found race horses that have had really bruised muscles in this area here. When we do thermography, this area shows the greatest heat quite often, and Russell himself has done some very nice research showing, with pressure mats, showing the pressure over this area here is not the same as what is up further along the rib cage. So we need to protect this square corner. As I mentioned, this girth is not a particularly good example of one to protect it. To protect the horse, we ideally need a girth that's 12 to 15 centimetres wide over this part of the corner of the rib cage. And we need to match it carefully to the shape of the horse's chest. So the fitter event is going to have a less circumference towards the rear and more towards the front. And the average horse is going to have the opposite. It's going to have a less circumference towards the front and more towards the rear, because the abdominal shape is quite the opposite. A standard straight through girth can work for 50% of the horses quite well, as long as it sort of meets those criteria. A sheepskin or fleece cover can make it more comfortable for the horse, and I think that's a good idea because many horses are prone to hypersensitivity through this area associated with upper thoracic spinal dysfunction. And I say that because when I treat the spinal dysfunction and rehabilitate horses from it, this sensitivity diminishes dramatically. So it's not just an idea. Ideally, we should have a custom girth for each horse with it anatomically shaped, even though that is prone to trouble as horses change chest shape with weight loss and weight gain, and with changes in fitness and back pain levels. So they'll change their bottom line, if you like, with various situations. For your average hack with a bit of belly, when using a straight girth, most often there will be a need for a front or tree point girth billet to be used, and the front buckle will need to be one hole higher than the one of the rear girth billet. So it'll have less of a circumference in front, so you'll actually have to take it up one hole on at least one side, if not both sides of the horse, to get the tension from front to back right. So with the girth, it's very important to do a bit of a home test if you can't get your saddle fitter there in time. But the things that you've got to look for is how the girth is matching down its length. We need to start at this point, make sure it's not digging into the horse, and then working our way down. In this case, the girth is not really touching much here, which is great, and not really touching much on the angle. It's a girth that's got a pad on it, so it's actually lifting away. But what you've really got to check on your girth is whether this part here is cutting into the horse on that sternal corner that I've been talking about. And make sure that when you're feeling from one side to another, there's equal tension on the front as there is on the back. If it's not equal tension, then you're going to have the girth putting too much pressure on one side. And this is typical of when an anatomical girth that's made for a fit eventer is used on a horse that's, say, got a big belly. That sort of girth is going to cut in at the back and be floppy at the front. Also, girths that cut in a little bit too quickly from being broad at the chest and then cutting in to allow elbow freedom will often put too much pressure on the sternal angle down at this point here. There are some straight girths that really transition quickly from being broader at the sternum to being narrower behind the elbow to allow elbow room. Sadly, this area often seems to cut in and be uncomfortable for horses down at that sternal corner that we're talking about, so beware of those. They can be a real problem in some horses. Anatomical girths have been a great advantage for fit adventers and other horses that have got more of a shape of this racehorse than they have of our average horse. In horses like the one shown on the right, the front of a straight girth needs to extend further than the back edge. Therefore, having additional space at the front and a smaller circumference at the rear in these anatomical girths significantly aids the distribution of the load of the girth over a larger surface area at the crucial sternal borders and around the whole girth for that matter. However, it's really important to be cautious if your horse doesn't have a fit eventer shape, because your horse's circumference is going to be quite different from front to back than this horse. This one's bigger at the front and smaller at the back. The average horse that we ride around is smaller at the front and bigger at the back. So quite the opposite to what these sort of anatomical girths are made for. And if we use these sort of girths on our average horse, what will happen is the front will be floppy and the back will cut into the belly of the horse and make them really uncomfortable. They might jam them down more, might make their shoulders more prominent, stop saddles moving forward, but that's all via bad means. So very much avoid using the wrong shaped girth for your horse. So we want to keep the pressure off the sternal corners, and the following are a couple of examples of how we are able to do that with different girths. So this is a girth that actually has a big plate going over the sternum, and you can see here, and also a big plate on the side that's minimizing the actual pressure on the corner of the sternum. So that's one way we can do it. Using a sheepskin liner is a good thing to add to those ones. And another way of doing it is using a pad between the sternum to lift the actual girth points off the angle of the sternum and protect it in that regard. And so there are a couple of examples of what you can do. Girths with elastic can be a bit of a problem child, or it can be a good thing. It just depends on how they're used. If you've got elastic that's quite readily stretched, it can act a bit like a bunchy strap and really tighten against the horse. So you can use too much force in tightening the girth, and the horses can be literally cut in two by the girth. and that is certainly not what any of us want. We don't want our horses hurt. If the girth has just got elastic on one side, the recommendation is actually to put it on the opposite side, so you are less likely to over tighten this. Even better is to use elastic that's really quite firm and doesn't stretch very much at all. It allows a little give, but it doesn't give that much give that you could have your saddle loosened in cases of high movement and the saddle shift on you. There are pads that alter saddle fit that I should comment on too. Remember, we want to avoid putting any pressure up here in the upper part of the wither. So we really need to have pads that don't come up as high. If we're using something like this, we need to cut back this upper portion and bevel it off so the pad doesn't lift it too high into the withers. This pad should go in the lower portion here and avoid pressure up higher up against the higher wither. And for that matter, Joyce Harmon did it very well, showing in her book on pain-free back and saddle fit that adding more and more pads here actually moves the saddle up and moves it into a more damaging point there as far as putting pressure over the top of the wither. So avoid putting too much under the saddle when there's no atrophy there, particularly if there's atrophy. Filling the spaces is certainly desirable, and these sort of pads can help in that regard, but they need to be used carefully. So I'm using this horse that's got quite a lot of muscle atrophy as a bit of an example here, but this horse would need a lot more than just a shim to support the saddle in the front. You would need an extra pad as well. Normally we prefer these horses to be exercised well enough to actually build up this area before we actually go into riding. But it's a good mannequin for showing where wither shims should be used. They shouldn't be used above that red line into the spinalis area. They should be used at the base of the wither, and normally we would slip them in between the saddle cloth and the saddle. The ones we most commonly use are 15 mils thick and of a foam that is similar to muscle in nature. And if you go onto my Spinal Bed Education channel, you'll see a whole video dedicated to the use of wither shims. Before I finish off, I wanted to comment on getting the horse to pick the right saddle. This I find is a big trap very often. In my experience of working with horse back pain and saddle fitting over the last 30 years, contrary to popular belief, horses are generally not that great at picking saddles that are going to be comfortable over the longer term. They're great at picking ones that feel good at the time, and sometimes just changing the saddle footprint from one that they're used to something different. Like I've had a client recently that was having a bit of trouble with her horse's horse's soreness, and she put a different saddle on it, a saddle that she knew was considerably wider than was appropriate for the horse. The horse went considerably better in it for a while, but then started deteriorating again, and deteriorating significantly. It's a matter of moving the pain footprint sometimes. So that saddle that the horse seemed to think was good, maybe just not pressing on the areas that it was subject to pain with its previous saddle. The other thing is, be wary that some saddles are made to be cushy right from the start for the rider and the horse, and some saddles are made to be worn in, so to speak, a bit more like the older style saddles. So just be wary that it's not just that it feels cushy just like a lovely new pair of runners that actually aren't the best runners for you, but they feel lovely and cushy, and so you bought them, but there were others that were actually quite a lot better for you. One of the things I find is that too often saddles seem to be good for the horse for 3 weeks and maybe up to 3 months, and then the horses start showing obvious behavior problems and start losing muscle over their back and start deteriorating in other ways in their performance. And because the saddle has been changed, they get the saddle fitter out and the saddle may be tuned up a bit, and then the horse will be improved for another couple of weeks maybe, and then they progressively go back to this bad behaviour that's developing, and that increases over time. But they think, well, I've had a new saddle that the horse was very happy with, I've had it checked, everything should be fine. It's not the saddle, it's something else that's going on with the horse. And sadly, that's quite the opposite to what really is happening. It's just that these saddles that had a different pain footprint are creating their own pain footprint now. What can also be dangerous about getting the horse to pick the right saddle is that saddles that are really quite suitable are ruled out because the horse sort of said no. And they said no because it was similar to their old saddle in some respects. And that can mean that you've lost an opportunity to use a saddle that was more appropriate for them. Sometimes too, a saddle is well suited to a horse, but it's not actually fitted appropriately to the horse at the time. And it's out of balance, and the horse doesn't feel good with it because it's out of balance, and the rider doesn't feel good with it because it's out of balance. But all it needs is fitting more appropriately to actually try it out properly. And this is one of the real problems with trying your mate's saddle on your horse to see whether it is working, whether it's a saddle you'd like to buy, or getting one online and not having it fitted properly before you try it out, and then giving up on it because it's actually not been well balanced. Or it can be that the saddle fitter just didn't do a great job, even though they were trying hard. They didn't actually balance it properly, or they didn't account for the fact that the flock was going to drop a lot more than they thought, or something like that. So just be really wary of the situation where you try saddles. Make sure it's in the right situation, the right fitting is done, not just a half-hearted sort of fitting done to check it. Because if you're out of balance, you're not going to like the saddle, and likewise the horse isn't. So the key take-home messages for selecting a saddle for your horse include picking saddles that avoid the more sensitive areas of your horse's back, so the tips of the vertebrae, of course, the upper part of the wither here where the muscle can be compressed against the bone, the small spinal muscles along through the saddle seat area in particular, protecting the small muscles over the angle of the rib cage, the dorsal serratus muscles, back of the scapula or shoulder blade cartilage, and also where the part of the serratus ventralis muscle, a very important supportive muscle, joins the back of the shoulder blade. And if your horse hasn't got a particularly strong and flat back that's going to support you no matter what, then you need to avoid pressure over the back of the rib cage where the rib cage and the loin join. We need to maximise the support of the rider's weight via maximum surface area. We're not going to go back to this sort of saddle, I know that. We need better panel than this though, and we need to avoid this cutback shoulder sort of setup where you're going to minimise the support through a critical area of the saddle construction. And we want to maximise or increase the support through the waist rather than having it nice and neat and small like this one. We also need to be mindful of monoflap saddles, not necessarily supporting the panels right through this area here, and as a result not performing as well as we would hope. Ideally we'll have saddles that don't put any pressure into this upper area here, that have nice long tree points to support the front panel, that don't have short tree points that are going to necessitate high panel contact and are going to cause more pressure over the critical area of the wither. Also, we want to avoid saddles that don't support the rider's weight through the saddle seat very well, that have a minimum of panel there. They might seem a good idea to fit it within the rib cage, but it's a disaster for the horse. This is loading the weakest part of the horse's back, as this saddle is here too, as a fulcrum right on this area. And lastly, please don't underestimate the value of spending money on a comfortable girth, especially one that minimises the pressure over those sternal corners that I was talking about, the costochondral junction. So we've been through saddle design and function. Thanks for your interest in this topic. In the interest of horse welfare, I believe it to be a highly important one. I hope this presentation gives riders a much greater appreciation of what they're sitting on, and also helps them make a better informed and better choice on behalf of the horses they love. So if you found this useful to you, there is more information on saddle design, saddle trauma and saddle fit, and other videos on this and related subjects that are freely available on my YouTube Spinal Vet Education channel. Happy viewing.